Alright, folks, welcome to Chapter 7 Storytelling and Narrative. Some games have a lot of story. Star Wars The Old Republic, the Elder Scrolls series, lots of backstory in that stuff. Even World of Warcraft has a ton of backstory. And then other games, not so much. With Mario, what was the story? I'm a plumber and I gotta save the princess from King Koopa. And that was basically it. Now, as the series progressed, then you got a little bit more information out of that, and the story kind of got a little bit bigger. But that when it started, that was the whole story. So in this chapter, the objectives, and blah 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 blah. All right. So why do we put stories in games? Well, stories add entertainment. They can attract a wider audience. If somebody's not into the gameplay, they might be attracted to the story itself. Which, if you've ever played Star Wars The Old Republic, which is a free-to-play online game, a lot of people don't really care for the gameplay too much, but some of the stories are so good. The bounty hunter story and how he's participating in the Great Hunt, and he's got this guy that's always putting obstacles in his way, trying to cheese his way to the top instead of doing it honorably. Once I got my first character to max level, I really didn't care for the game too much, but I wanted to go through all the different stories because most of them were pretty good. So because of those stories, I was able to keep subscribing for a couple months as I worked my way through the other stories. And so the bottom line is stories help sell your game. They help generate more revenue. Hooray! Alright, so the story should not be more important than the gameplay. When you're creating your game, you got to think about, how long is your game going to be? If it's a relatively short game, it doesn't need, a huge story. You need to focus on the individual characters, and then you need to decide how much realism do I need to include. It's all great to have a game that's super real, but if it takes away from the fun, then that's not cool. One example of that is Call of Duty. Oh, actually, I want to go back to, is it Quake? I want to say it was Quake. But basically, people started bunny hopping. They started jumping up and down to avoid getting shot. And the designers were like, "Oh crap, we didn't design this in there, and that's not really real. I mean, on the battlefield, you don't see soldiers jumping up and down like a bunch of rabbits. So we need to take that out." So they took it out, and then all the players screamed and said, "Hey, wait a minute, we love this. Don't remove it." And then they put it back in. So it's been in all the online shooter games since then. So sometimes the amount of realism might not need to be as drastic as you think. And then the emotional richness. Remember, when you're designing a game, you're trying to evoke an emotion in the player, and sometimes the story can help that. If you're making a game about a player trying to rescue his lost love or whatever, you don't want the story to be a comedy. So think about the emotion that you're trying to get out of the player, and then just design your story accordingly. So a story is it's just a series of events, and those events should be relatively credible, coherent, and dramatically meaningful. When we introduce new characters in the story, those characters need to be included in our game. They need to have some impact on the game. And you can make the story interactive by having player events, in-game events, narrative events. Some games do this very well, and others don't do it very well at all. In some of the original MMOs, the online games, they actually had GMs that would have player events, and they would pop up in a city and say, "Hey, quick, everybody, prepare for the orc invasion," and then they would spawn, 200 orcs outside the city and have them come in and just crush people. And it was up to the players to defend. Now we don't see that a whole lot anymore. And I don't know if it's a cost issue or what. But now we see things like if you play Guild Wars 2, as you're running along, all of a sudden you'll pop into different events. Hey, this farmer's being attacked by this, or this kind of thing is happening, and then all the players can join in that event until it's finished. All right, and then there's narrative events, and narrative events could be really anything. Voiceovers, scrolling text, cutscenes. Most of the time we see these as cutscenes. Alright, and then your book mentions agency and dramatic freedom. And agency is the player's power to change the future of the story. And again, Star Wars The Old Republic is a good example of this. If I'm a Sith, I could be a good Sith or a bad Sith. And I could kill all of my enemies, or I could let them live. So the story will change based on your actions. If I let somebody live, they might come back later on to help me. One of the first missions on the Sith side, um, you're taking over a ship, and you're attacking a much larger ship, and you have to decide whether to kill the captain because he has disobeyed orders. And if you kill him, the second in charge doesn't have the experience, and you have to do a lot more fighting. But if you spare his life, he's got more experience, and he knows how to fend off the enemy to avoid a lot of the conflict. But you don't know that, when the choice comes to kill this guy or let him live. So that's dramatic freedom. You're free to choose your path, and then whatever your choice is, it will change the choices later on. And then Fable is another good example of this, the Fable series. All right, and then we have dramatic tension or gameplay tension. So dramatic tension comes from the plot. Gameplay tension comes from the challenges. So you may start seeing some cutscenes near the end where you're about to face the final boss, and that's dramatic tension, and then as you're fighting him, that's actually gameplay tension. And music goes a long way in creating tension in games. If you've ever watched some of the cartoon series, especially the anime, Naruto is a good example. When different things happen, the music changes, and it's always the same type of music. When it's I don't want to say a love scene, but when the characters are kind of bonding, there's always a certain music that plays, and then when the fight's getting tough, there's always a certain music that plays. So that as you watch the series, by the time you get into the 50th episode or something, as soon as that music starts, you automatically know that you're about to see something cool happen. They're about to fight, and it's about to get crazy. All right, moving on. The storytelling engine, weaves together the gameplay and the story. So we put triggers in our games. When the character reaches here, this happens. When the character talks to this person, this happens. This is when the cutscene kind of pops in. So that's the storytelling engine. So your typical video game is like a loop. When you code a program like Microsoft Word, when the user's done, let's say I open up my Word document, I type half a page, and then I get up and I leave. Word doesn't do anything. It just sits there and it waits for user input. Video games are not like that. Video games have this infinite loop, and this loop continues to run until you shut the game off. And when your character just stands there, other things are happening in the game. Day and night cycles are occurring. NPCs are walking around, but different things are happening in the game. Just because the player stops moving doesn't mean the game stops moving. And then as your player hits different triggers, different code is run, from inside the loop, and then you get these different actions. So the storytelling engine kind of looks like this. You got the player, he's got inputs and outputs, and then we use the user interface, and we mess with the core mechanics, and the core mechanics will trigger the storytelling engine that'll give us our narrative events and that kind of thing. All right, so as far as stories go, there's a couple different ways to do those. The first one's a linear story. The original Mario, actually even Donkey Kong, was a very linear story. You can't change the story. Donkey Kong's up at the top, he's got the princess, and your job is to get to the top, and that's it. There's no other story. You can't change anything. It's either you're going to go kick Donkey Kong's butt or he's going to kick your butt. So they're nice because they require less content. The storytelling engine is simpler. You don't have to worry about all the player's choices because you know where you're going to direct them to. They're less prone to bugs and absurdities, and you can invoke a greater emotional response or emotional power out of the game because you're focusing everything on the player. Like there's no way he can skip anything, which also means you're denying them dramatic freedom. So linear stories are good places to start when you do video games. And if you look at the video game industry, at first almost all the games were linear, and then we've kind of progressed. Most studios start small. We make a linear game. We might make a game for mobile phone to generate a little bit of revenue, that kind of stuff. And once we've got 2 or 3 of those underneath our belt, then we'll kind of expand on that experience and then kind of go into the non-linear stories. These ones, they're a lot more expensive to create. They're complicated because you have to build these big choice chains. When the player gets here and they choose this, now I need to break them off to the left. Or if they choose option B, then I need to break them off to the right. And then I need to have a whole path for both of those two options. And each option that you present the character with means you need to have separate storylines. So they're tougher to build. They're way more complicated, but they allow more replayability in games because the player can play through multiple different ways. So it's not like a linear game. Once you beat Donkey Kong, you kind of know how to beat Donkey Kong, and you're kind of done with the game. But when you play a different game, like let's say Star Wars: The Old Republic, and you get through one quest chain or one person's thing, oh, I can go back and do that again as a bad guy because this time I did it as a good guy. I want to see the difference. So it adds that replayability. It keeps people playing the game. When we think about games like Halo and Team Fortress 2, those games have had huge lifespans just because of the way they were designed. If we look at the Elder Scrolls series, there are so many mods for those games. The longer your game lasts and the more tools you give players, the more players will create extra content and stuff for you, and the longer your game will be popular or still be part of the average player's experience. Skyrim has been running for years and it's still selling on Steam. People are still picking it up. Alright, and then you got some foldback stories where maybe you limit the amount of freedom that they have. Maybe they only have a few choices that you can kind of do in the game. And then based on their choice, eventually they still always come back into the single branch or the single linear story that you want. So it kind of appears that they have some freedom, but eventually they kind of come back to the same story. So these are obviously the cheapest of the nonlinear stories to create or nonlinear games. They're also the most commercially successful. When you think about the Elder Scrolls Skyrim, there's a lot of side stories and a lot of choices you can make, but there's one main quest line that you're always brought back into, and that's the same for everybody. Alright, and then emergent narrative. Now, no games use purely emergent narrative where the player creates kind of their own stories, but there have been some games that have done a pretty good job of this. Star Wars Galaxies years ago was a sandbox game, meaning when you got in there, you created your Star Wars character, and there were no levels. Just there were skills, and you could level. You had a certain amount of skills that you could level. So you could be like, max out your pistoling skills, and then you could be the most deadly pistolero and that kind of stuff. But again, there were no quests and there were no levels, and you were free to do what you wanted. So you kind of made your own story. So if you wanted to be like the coolest weaponsmith in the galaxy, you could be. And if another player was more interested in being a bounty hunter and go out and actually kill players and get bounties on players, he could be. So there was a lot of different, there wasn't a story put in there by the game designers. It was meant for, hey, you're now in the Star Wars universe. You can do what you want. You've got that sand. Here's the sandbox. Here's the sand. Do what you want with it. And there's several games out there like this. If you've ever played EVE Online, EVE kind of puts you in a science fiction universe, and you can do what you want. There's like an inner core series of planets and systems that's like the Empire in there, and you're relatively safe in there. Or you go out to what they call null-sec space, where there are no rules and anybody can attack you. And you can build player stations, so you could be like a mission runner and run missions if you want. You can be a trader and go to different stations and buy and sell, commodities. You can be a builder, you can be a miner, but basically when you're in the game doesn't point you like World of Warcraft. All the guys have little exclamation points over their head. You go, you get some missions, and then you go and do those missions, and you come back and turn them in. And that's the whole like they lead you kind of through there. But with sandbox games, they don't do that. You're just popped in the box, and then it's up to you what you're going to do with the sand. All right, and then they talk about endings. So, if you've got multiple paths, you've got to have multiple endings. And this is one of the things that killed Mass Effect 3. The ending was terrible, the original ending. Your ending should provide an emotionally satisfying conclusion. It shouldn't leave the player with a WTF look on their face. That kind of stuff. So if your game ends, if there are multiple ways for your game to end, you want to have multiple endings, that are consistent with the player's choices. If I was evil all the way through, the last thing I want to see is, rainbows and unicorns at the end of my game. Alright, and then granularity. How often do I present this narrative? How often am I seeing cutscenes? Do I have the option to skip past cutscenes? Alright, and then ways to advance the plot. You could advance it as a series of challenges. With Mario, or Super Mario Brothers, he always had these different locations, and that was kind of like how the game progressed. Your story was, okay, now I'm in the sewer. Crap, I got to get through the sewer. Now I got to get through the Mushroom Kingdom, and now I got to get through this. Or it can be a journey. When I arrive at a specific location, something specific happens. So I have the choice if I want to pause the story and maybe do something else in the game, and then go to that location later on. So I control the pace myself. And story is drama. And that's where the storytelling engine advances the plot. You can't really control the pace. In the original Wing Commander games, every time you finished a mission, you got the next mission, and you couldn't pause that mission and go do other stuff. You had to keep working through the story, and advancing the plot that way. So there are limits to how much emotion you can pull out of a person based on the story and stuff. And the bottom line is the player's avatar should survive. Companions can die, things like that, and we've seen that through Mass Effect and some other games. And we know what kind of emotional effect that has on us. But when the main character dies, that's when it's like, really? I just got done playing this game for 40 hours, and then my dude dies? That's not the emotion that we want to leave our players with. Alright, and then, we can have scripted conversations in our game with dialogue trees. And these are very important to keep track of. If you look at some of the games like, again, Star Wars The Old Republic, huge dialogue trees, because there are so many different choices, and there's light side choices and dark side choices. And then if you killed the guy here, then you don't get to talk to the guy here, and so big long pathways. So you always want to write these out on paper or some other method before you start implementing them. And you'll see what I mean when you start creating this. Okay, player has choice A, B, and C. Well, they pick A, and then this and this and this happens, and then B happens. Or when choice B happens, they pick this. Oh, well, this is so cool in A. Why can't I have something like this in B and C? Well, now I need to redo A and that kind of stuff. But allowing the player choice really will help you to attract more and retain people with different playing styles. My wife isn't really into games a whole lot, but when she's not really into the killing thing, that kind of stuff. Some people are very aggressive, and they want to have the aggressive choices. Some people want to be the hero and save everybody. Some people don't. Alright, so when do you start writing the story? Well, you want to kind of make a list of the episodes or levels during the concept stage. And then you start writing the story during the elaboration stage. It's like at Stark State, like whenever we propose a new class, they don't expect us to create the class syllabus, when we propose the class, because if it gets turned down, that's a lot of wasted work. So you just make like a list of episodes or levels or major events that are going to happen in your game. And that's included in the concept stage. And then you can flesh that all out during the elaboration stage. So some things to remember. You're not writing a novel. You're trying to create an interactive game. You're not trying to win any writing awards, that kind of stuff. You're trying to keep the player in his emotional state that you want, and you're trying to keep pushing out that emotion. You also want to make sure that you leave loopholes and things so that you can have a sequel, because sequels are vital sources of income. When we look at Halo, and then Halo 2 and Halo 3 and all the other games that it spawned, or Mass Effect and Mass Effect 2, Mass Effect 3, you want to have space for sequels. If you create all the characters and you kill them all at the end except for the player, and you've closed all the plot holes, that doesn't really leave you a whole lot of room for sequels. And that's the number one reason why a lot of the games, when they first come out, don't tell the full story of X character, and you're always wondering you're left after playing with all these questions. And then the sequel comes out, and then you get the answers to some of these questions. So, and sometimes we can do that with DLC, the downloadable content, like in Destiny. And then other times we do it with full sequels, like Mass Effect, Mass Effect 2, Mass Effect 3, that kind of thing. All right, and that about wraps us up. So let's take a look to see what you've got going on this week in Angel. Alright, you got all kinds of stuff in your materials folder, tools, a story mapping tool, a video on a storytelling game conference, so a whole bunch of stuff there. And under assignments, you've got stories and narratives, and then top 5 video games with great stories. Now, this one here is a forum. So now it's your turn. Pick your top 5 video games that contain a great story. And then the first one is your assignment. And you'll write this out and submit it on in Angel there. So if you have any questions, make sure you email me. Other than that, have a great week, folks.